Are you passionate about foreign policy, national security, and the latest in domestic politics? Consider becoming a member of the DSR Network, your go-to source for in-depth analysis and insightful discussions. With the DSR Network podcasts, stay ahead of the curve on global affairs. Each episode features top experts, policymakers, and thought leaders who break down complex issues into digestible, engaging conversations. From breaking news to historical context, we cover the topics that matter most. Whether it's the intricacies of international diplomacy, the latest in national security strategies, or the dynamics of U.S. politics, the DSR Network has you covered. Members receive an ad-free listening experience, bonus content for virtually all of our shows, an invitation to join the DSR Slack community, enhanced show notes for select podcasts, and much more. Visit thedsrnetwork.com/buy and enter code GRADUATE to receive 30% off the regular membership price for the first year or first month. That's thedsrnetwork.com/buy and code GRADUATE. Thank you very much for your support.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. On Wednesday, the Wall Street Journal published a hit piece about President Biden's age. Then something unusual happened. A number of Democratic lawmakers went absolutely nuclear on the piece, publicly attacking it by going on record to forcefully undermine its core assertions. That's something Republicans do more often than Democrats. So we think this moment deserves some discussion. Is there some better way that Dems can quote-unquote work the refs the way Republicans do? When liberals and Dems do criticize coverage, why do newsroom leaders often seem to just shrug it off? Why do editors keep insulting our intelligence with phony justifications for the overemphasis on Biden's age? And what can readers do about this? Today we're discussing this with Aaron Rupar, who is one of the shrewdest observers of the media on his Public Notice Substack. You probably know Rupar from his video-packed Twitter threads, too. Great to have you on, Aaron.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure, Greg.
First, let's go through some of the problems with this absurd piece, which is titled, "Behind Closed Doors, Biden Shows Signs of Slipping." It purports to quote participants in meetings, but the primary sources are Kevin McCarthy and Mike Johnson. That alone is absurd, but as many then pointed out, it's been reported that McCarthy privately told people in 2023 that he found Biden mentally sharp in meetings. Brian Beutler also flagged something interesting, that this story is at odds with public accounts of how Biden effectively persuaded Johnson to support Ukraine aid. And the piece is loaded up with a lot of slimy innuendo and rhetorical tricks. Am I missing anything? Did I do justice to it there, Aaron?
I think you did justice to it. It's a very odd piece, and for people who haven't read it, it's very lengthy, and it almost kind of reads at points like a performance review for specific meetings that Biden has had. There are basically 3 meetings that it kind of hones in on, where there were a group of people in attendance. I think actually one of the 3 was just Johnson and Biden, and so you have the added issue of you're basically taking Mike Johnson's word against Biden's, and we all know that Mike Johnson is not a good faith operator. So yeah, it's just a very weird piece, and I think the other component of this is obviously the timing coming shortly after Trump's conviction. Certainly it occurred to me that, there might be kind of a political component to this as well, seeing as how it was published in a Murdoch publication.
Absolutely. And let's talk about how Democrats unloaded on the piece for a moment. Senators Patty Murray and Jack Reed said on Twitter that they were at one of the meetings in question and shared directly contrary experiences of Biden with the Journal, but they weren't included. Senator Chris Coons, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper all said they'd talked to the Journal about their experiences with Biden, but they weren't included either. This is kind of unusual, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And one of the reporters, Siobhan Hughes, who is one of the 2 whose byline on this piece, was on CNN and actually was asked specifically about that component where, Dems are complaining that they weren't quoted, and they had experiences that kind of cut against the thesis of the piece. And basically she said, well, we couldn't include all of the quotes. So we had to make decisions about who to include and who not to include. And, her talking point was that the perspective that some of these Dems had was represented by quotes that did make it into the piece. But that's kind of an interesting, these are interesting kind of counter narratives and counter experiences that people have had. And as you mentioned, I think the most important thing to kind of highlight here is that Kevin McCarthy has made comments privately that made it into news reporting. I believe one of the stories was in the New York Times about negotiations he had with Biden about a year ago, where he conveyed that he thought Biden was sharp in meetings and, seemed to be very with it. And so, to kind of turn around here a year later and present a contrary narrative seems pretty dubious. And, it certainly appears that these reporters, to an extent, got worked here.
What struck me about this as well, taking into account the pushback that you just mentioned, that these sentiments from these Democrats were echoed by other quotes, these Democrats, at least some of them, were in the very meeting that was written about. That's why I think it's unusual that their direct perspective wasn't included.
Yeah, definitely. And beyond that, I think another thing that is weird here that is related to what you're talking about is that the only two named people in the piece who kind of bolster the thesis of it, which is that Biden is slipping, are Mike Johnson and Kevin McCarthy. And so you think when you have these other prominent politicians, elected officials who were in these meetings, who have firsthand knowledge of what happened there, to not include them, I think kind of speaks to how the thumb was on the scale in terms of how this was presented.
Let's talk a little bit about how the media works here. We all know this. A piece like this, which the news organization in question is very deliberately and consciously presenting as a major journalistic event, we all know that this kind of piece is going to have direct and intensive involvement from the very top people at the news organization. Right? This kind of thing lands with a real blow, and there's just no way that every line wasn't worked over very carefully by a team of editors. How could something like this happen?
Well, I think, first of all, it's a Murdoch publication. And so you kind of see how this works today, where, a big part of what I do for my beat is monitoring right-wing media. And, as you would expect on Fox News, Fox Business, Newsmax, this was topic number one today, was this story in the Wall Street Journal. And so, you kind of get this out there and it sort of stands on its own in the Wall Street Journal, but then it also becomes grist for talking head panels on cable news, for right-wing TV. And so, the political aspect of it, I think, is pretty clear, where it kind of changes the topic from Trump's conviction on felony charges to today, all of a sudden, we're back to talking about Biden being old and senile with pretty thin basis for that. But Greg, you're exactly right. Even going back to my experiences at Vox, whenever you have a major story like this, and I believe towards the top of the story, it's mentioned that the authors interviewed something like 45 different people over a course of many months. It's not to say that all these interviews necessarily corresponded directly to this piece, but clearly they had been talking to people kind of in the background with the intent of doing something on Biden slipping, being senile. That doesn't happen. That takes a lot of involvement from a lot of different people in the newsroom, including some of the top editors, I'm sure. And, this piece was published yesterday. I checked just before we got on this call, and it's still, many hours later, 16, 20 hours later, on the homepage of the Wall Street Journal. So you're exactly right that whenever a piece gets that sort of promotion and, is featured so prominently in a major publication like the Wall Street Journal, there's a lot of people, including some of the top ones, who are involved in that.
There's another thing that from that CNN interview with one of the reporters that's worth mentioning. She was asked how it is that McCarthy could privately say Biden is sharp and then publicly tell the Journal the opposite. And the reporter said that McCarthy might have been, quote unquote, tactically praising Biden at the time for reasons related to ongoing negotiations. Come on. Couldn't McCarthy be tactically distorting the truth about those meetings with Biden right now to serve the Republican Party's chief attack line on Biden in the current presidential election? This is absurd.
That was the follow-up. I was screaming in my head while watching that interview. And Boris Sanchez, who is one of the CNN anchors who conducted that interview, seemed like he did push back on a couple points. For instance, there was one where Siobhan Hughes mentioned that no one at the White House was disputing the facts in the piece. And then he pointed out that actually that's not true, that there's some reporting in this piece about how people at meetings were having a hard time hearing Biden because he was speaking so faintly. But it turned out that that was kind of a point of contention where there are other people who were in the room who are saying, no, he's speaking normally. I didn't have a hard time hearing him. And Boris pointed that out. And then she basically kind of took the L on that one. We're like, well, yeah, but we thought the preponderance of the evidence was such that we felt comfortable including that. And but that was the one in particular where, she kind of gave McCarthy the benefit of the doubt that, well, when he said that Biden was sharp in this meeting, he was just being tactful because they were having debt ceiling negotiations and it was imperative they get a deal done. And so he was just being nice to Biden. But then, the fact that she wouldn't kind of take that extra step logically and think, well, maybe I'm getting work now when he's being tactful, because clearly Kevin McCarthy wants to be Trump's chief of staff or have some other prominent role in a second Trump administration. I was upset that that wasn't asked during that interview, but even without that fellow being asked, I thought that kind of the holes in the piece were very apparent during that TV hit.
I do want to bring up something you said before about how the publishers of a piece like this know that it's going to have this major ripple effect in right-wing media. And of course, that's one reason that they publish it. But there's a dark side to this as well, which is that the quote-unquote MSM tends to have an amplifying effect here too. The chyron on that CNN TV piece that you were talking about and flagged read, quote, Democrats defend Biden after WSJ story on mental fitness. That automatically makes the pro-Biden side of the argument sound defensive, like spin. And there's a bigger problem here, which is that coverage like this is automatically gamed. The story quotes administration officials defending Biden's sharpness, but because it's framed around Biden's slippage, alleged slippage, those responses sound defensive, right? The story puts a thumb on the scale in favor of one set of claims, the Republican ones. And even the CNN chyron did this, though CNN itself sees reasons for skepticism about the story. This is a problem. This is a deep structural problem, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when we see polling that indicates that Biden's age is such a huge issue in this campaign cycle, and then you wonder why that is, or, people at CNN wonder why that is, it's because of segments like that, kind of reinforce these talking points. And, this whole narrative around Biden's age is kind of a tricky one because, something that even comes up in stories like this and you hear all the time is kind of this conflation of the fact that Biden for his whole life has had a speech impediment. And so he kind of stammers and at times will stutter. And, this is oftentimes kind of confused for some sort of slippage or that, he's not cogent. And in reality, the evidence to kind of back up these claims of mental decline are very, very thin. Obviously Biden a number of years ago broke his foot. And so, we can see that when he walks, he has a little bit more of a stiff gait now. And obviously anybody, when you go from the age of, 75 or so when he was running for the presidency to being 81 now, anybody who goes from 75 to 81 is going to age a little bit and appear a little bit older. But beyond kind of the natural aging that anyone would have, there's really no evidence backing up this idea that he's in mental decline or can't do the job or is, in much worse shape, cognitively than he was a few years ago. And so, it's unfortunate. I think, this whole narrative is kind of built, it's built on a house of cards in that way. But when you have stories like this that drop and then you have all of these talking head panels on cable that kind of reinforce it, you can understand how people who aren't following the news as closely as yourself or myself might come away from watching an afternoon of cable news, tuning into a segment or two of CNN with an idea that Biden is slipping and that, it really could be something that imperils a possible second term for him.
I think you're hitting on something really, really important there. So the ordinary voter, the low information voter, someone who casually pays attention to politics just a little bit here and there, of course they're going to have concerns about Biden's age, kind of, created in them by clips of Biden having problems talking and having problems walking, which happens when you age, right? But it seems to me that the responsibility of people who take it as a professional mission to inform people is to tell them whether it's an actual concern or not when it comes to their handling of the presidency. And yet we hear constantly from newsroom leaders that they're covering Biden's age the way they are because voters are concerned about it. But as you point out, it's self-reinforcing, right? Now, look, nobody would say Biden's age is not a relevant topic, but still when newsroom figures make justifications like this, they're just playing games and it just drives me nuts. I mean, where are you on this? Do you think I'm being too harsh on newsroom leaders for saying this kind of thing?
Well, I don't think you're being too harsh on the Wall Street Journal newsroom leaders. And, one of the things that's kind of interesting here is that I actually find a lot of the Wall Street Journal coverage, like of the war in Ukraine or foreign policy issues, Gaza, I find their coverage in those areas to be quite solid and good in a lot of respects. It's the domestic politics stuff that kind of gets painted with this Murdoch brush and kind of being, you can see the similarities between Fox Business, and then the Wall Street Journal on the other hand, and how, kind of the politicized political coverage, for lack of a better way of putting it. And so, yeah, really in a lot of instances with a story like this, I tend not to read a lot of their domestic political coverage just because it kind of makes my blood pressure rise and I get upset about it. I rely more on people like you and Josh Marshall and, people to kind of filter it and then present it to me, with more of a take. But in this case, because the story was clearly going to drive news last night and today, I felt obligated to read it. And it kind of reminded me why I don't like reading a lot of their domestic political stuff, because you don't really come away informed. And, I think there's kind of an analogy here between a lot of the coverage that we saw in the lead up to January 6th, where, Republicans were kind of citing the concerns that people had about voter integrity and election integrity as a reason that they kept talking about it, or, like the concerns that people had were evidence that there was merit to their claims. And there's something kind of similar here with the Biden age discussion where, the fact that people cite this as such a top issue is the reason it gets covered so much. But, part of the reason that people cite it as being a top issue is because it gets covered so much. So there's kind of a circularity here that's infuriating. And you would hope that to the extent journalism is the conveying of information to people, that reporters would kind of take a step back, not just regurgitate kind of anxieties that people have, but try to kind of unpack them. And in this case, when we're facing an election that's existential, put in context that there should really be bigger issues and kind of these nebulous worries that Biden is too old for the job when there isn't a lot of evidence to back that notion up.
There's a structural problem here as well, Aaron, I think. I guarantee you that this scalding criticism from Dems and liberals on Twitter doesn't mean a whole lot to the Journal's editors. From their point of view, this episode just shows that they're willing to take on and piss off Dems, so they're not the liberal media, right? That's kind of in addition to the clear benefits that they think that they derive from putting out something that's going to create a huge explosion in right-wing media and get them a lot of attention. There's a deep problem here in which right-wing criticism of the media just does matter more to news organizations than liberal or democratic criticism does, even though newsroom leaders themselves know perfectly well that the right is working the refs there. I mean, so what's the answer? Should Dems try to work the refs harder? It just seems like that's bound to do little because of this built-in dynamic I identified there. What do you think?
I think it can hurt to work the refs harder. And, actually I was kind of heartened just before I got on this call with you, Chris Coons, who, is a senator who from Delaware, who is very kind of mild-mannered, very Mr. Bipartisanship. He was on Fox and he actually pushed back on Martha McCallum, where he said something to the effect of, the reason that people are so concerned about Biden's age is because you guys won't stop talking about it, which to me, was a very un-Chris Coons-like talking point. But, I think that's good to, if you're going to go on Fox, and, there's kind of a whole separate debate about whether Dems should do that. But, if you're going to be interviewed by the Wall Street Journal and go on Fox, be prepared to push back and hold them accountable for when you think that they're falling short or misleading their audience. And so, I don't think that's a panacea, but, in a lot of respects, that's the best that you can do. And I think what's, really disappointing here is that there were a lot of Dems, as we talked about earlier, who did engage with their journal and did talk to reporters and, presumably thought that they would be a voice that would be included in the story, and they weren't. And so, I guess that kind of shows the shortcomings to an extent of working the refs. If you try to work the refs, but then they just ignore you or they interview you and don't include your quotes in the story. But, I think to kind of get out there with media criticism, on social media channels, or whether that's on Fox or on MSNBC, I think that's a good thing to try and kind of reveal and expose these right-wing outlets for what they are.
There's got to be a way Dems can figure out and how to kind of go at the media when it really pulls this kind of crap. And I agree that Chris Coons moment was really heartening. In fact, I was pretty surprised by how aggressively all these Democrats unloaded on the Journal over this.
Yeah, and there's just the other reality, which is that for people on the left, I mean, there's people who are doing columns like you, or like I do at Public Notice or Josh Marshall, but there isn't really in these mainstream outlets. I mean, I think we end up getting more mad than we are pleased with a lot of their coverage because it does really seem like, for Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, I mean, these reporters and editors are bending over backward to appear fair to Republicans, but you don't really see the same deference paid to liberals. And I guess you could probably write like a book or do a psychological study as to why that is. But, there isn't really like a commensurate outlet that is doing news for a mainstream audience that is willing to kind of punch right, like some of these outlets do, punching left.
So what can readers do about this? You're in this kind of space where you're on Substack, you criticize the media, you see the unfiltered political scene, and then you see how filtered it is when the big news organizations get through with it. What is there any way to be effective for liberal readers? I mean, I think probably when all of liberal Twitter pounds on some headline, it has an effect, it alters a headline. But these deeper structural dynamics seem problematic, and I don't know what to do about them. Do you have a sense of what readers can do about them?
So, Greg, I think you're absolutely right that holding these outlets accountable on social media is important because, even for people who aren't immersed in this stuff like we are, you see that. You see when a reporter is getting ratioed for an irresponsible story or a bad headline. And, that's just kind of a basic accountability function that, with a lot of these outlets no longer having public editors, kind of falls upon readers or people who are on social media to get their voice out there as they can, which these days mainly is obviously going to happen on social media. I think the other thing is just being selective about who you give your money to. Myself being in the media and running a publication, I subscribe to pretty much everything that I can just because I want to be able to access all the different content that's out there. But if if you have a budget in terms of news media and you want to spend it wisely, I guess this would be a demerit against the Wall Street Journal, obviously. And so, just those kind of basic consumer choices, at a time where obviously the financial model for news media is kind of under stress, to put it mildly. Not that you ever want to be punitive and cost journalists their jobs, but, when you see really irresponsible coverage like this, I think as a consumer, you have to kind of take that into consideration and, possibly withhold your subscription dollars to try and, kind of vote with your dollars, so to speak.
I mean, this gets at another deep problem, though, right? Because it really should be said, and you said this earlier, and I'll stress it as well. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, they do absolutely stellar work a lot of the time, really deeply revelatory work about the threat Trump poses. But one can acknowledge that while also pointing out the instances where they clearly are making serious mistakes. And the problem with, the threat of withholding subscriptions and all is one would deprive oneself of the good stuff these places are doing. And so I don't really see a simple answer to the situation here. I mean, it just seems very problematic in many ways.
Yeah, you're right. And it's, and I've chosen myself to kind of err on the side of, I haven't canceled any subscriptions over things like this, but I do try and hold outlets accountable online or in my newsletter. And obviously, if you're someone who is just a consumer of information and don't have a large social media platform, that can be more complicated. But, again, I mean, I think it gets back to this is an existential election and you just want outlets to be kind of cognizant of that. And, I'm not surprised that, a Murdoch-owned Wall Street Journal isn't part of the resistance or, isn't devoting a lot of time and energy to trying to make the case against Trump. But, when you're kind of presenting these nebulous concerns about Biden's age or cognition as being, something that voters should really be deeply concerned about as they're choosing who to vote for in November, I think we all kind of understand that there are bigger things going on, bigger issues to be concerned about this election cycle than that. And so, yeah, you're right that if you unsubscribe from the Wall Street Journal, you'll be missing some of their fantastic coverage of Ukraine. But these are not easy choices to make, and I think there's only limited things that you can do. And so, from the standpoint of what can a reader do to kind of get their voice heard, I do think that unsubscribing has to be on the table. Although I will also caution that, like with the New York Times, I've heard that you have to jump through a number of hoops to even be able to do that and spend some time on the phone explaining why you're unsubscribing and whatnot. So even that can be kind of complicated, but. There's no easy solutions and there's no easy way to make your voice heard. But, it did harden me to pull up some of the Wall Street Journal editors who were tweeting this piece out this morning, it'd see that they were being ratioed pretty hard and people were being very critical. And I think that's kind of a basic accountability function that, that's one of the nice things about social media. Obviously, Twitter gets a lot of flack and social media more broadly, but the fact that people can get their voice directly heard and it can be seen by other people online, I think that's important.
I do as well. I just wish that in cases like this, it made a bigger difference. Aaron Rupar, thanks so much for coming on with us today, man. It was great to talk to you.
My pleasure.
Folks, we have some content for you up at TNR.com that's much, much, much better than that Wall Street Journal piece, guaranteed. Megan Winter on Ron DeSantis' voter suppression machine and how it's working, and Melissa Gira-Grant on the real reason for Louisiana's new mifepristone law. We'll see you all tomorrow. You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler and the DSR Network.